Good morning. Thank you so much for the welcome. It's really my tremendous pleasure to be here. Forgive me, just want to make sure that can be heard. All right, so to get underway with our session, I would like to lay the groundwork with an introduction to codicological studies. And I should say, again, I would like to convey my deepest gratitude to everyone involved in coordinating this workshop, disseminating the invitation, for all of you for being here, and everyone who arranged my visit. So I really am delighted to be here, and I hope that you will all benefit. I would like to say, prepare yourselves. This is going to be incredibly intense. A lot of material we will cover. If I had distributed readings in advance, you probably would have succumbed under the under the weight, just given the density of what we are going to cover. Really jam-packed 2.5 days. But nevertheless, I'm sure that you will benefit. I'm going to share the slides as Luke recommends, and so you will be able to engage with this material after our session. So please don't feel that you need to try and absorb everything in the course of the discussion. You will have the material accessible to you afterward, and actually that's going to be really crucial because it would be otherwise impossible to deeply engage with this content in an hour and 15 minutes, for example, to cover, introduction to codicological studies and writing material, for example. So just be prepared. That's forthcoming. Okay, as I said, in this first session, we want to lay the groundwork. So we're going to establish a few sort of working definitions, ensure that our understanding is in place for ideas such as manuscript culture, codex, codicology, codicological studies. Why are we even interested in codicological studies? And then I will give a brief introduction to the field of Islamic manuscript studies, and then introduce some workshop practicalities, again, just so that you can take the most from this workshop, given the format that we have. So, what is a manuscript? Who would like to contribute a thought? What is a manuscript? What distinguishes a manuscript from any other type of book? We can at least start there. Let's agree that a manuscript is a kind of book. If you'll forgive me, someone may have wanted to to offer that, but what is a manuscript? And what is distinguishing a manuscript? Thank you, yes. Anyone else want to add to that?
Unpublished work?
Potentially, yeah. That's an excellent start. Oh, yeah.
Something that's been vetted enough to make it into an archive?
Potentially, okay. Yeah, that's really an excellent start. So ultimately, what distinguishes a manuscript from any other type of document or book or recorded work is that it is copied and produced by hand. That is essentially the only distinction. It's inherent, of course, in the term that we use to refer to these materials. They are documents, so they are, as such, witnesses for particular text. They carry text. But they also possess significant paratexts. This is information beyond the text. We're going to have an entire session tomorrow discussing paratexts and annotations. These often include details that speak to their history of circulation, ownership, use, engagement with the object itself, with the works carried within that object, etc. They also possess compelling material qualities. So that includes such things as script, layout, ornament, structure, writing material, binding, enclosure, repairs, and so forth. Okay, so this will be our working definition, our working understanding for manuscripts, right? Okay. What is a manuscript culture? Anybody encountered this term before? Who would like to offer us an idea of what we mean by this? or what it means to you. Yes.
I think about everything that's involved in what it took to produce these artifacts. So like how scribes are taught and the physical tools that they use.
Absolutely, absolutely. Would anyone else like to add to that?
Also the ways that manuscripts circulate and who reads them and how.
Absolutely. Anything else to add?
Would the preservation aspect be also included?
Sure, potentially, yes. Longevity of what is produced, absolutely.
Patronage.
Patronage. Anything else?
Ritual contexts.
Yes, this is very rich and expensive, actually. So thank you for all of these contributions. So you really have, I think, touched on it well. This will be my humble offering of a kind of working definition for our discussion. So contexts, many contexts of production, circulation, reception, in which texts were primarily circulated in manuscript. So one of the main distinctions here is that reproduction or circulation of text, production of copies by hand, characterizes a manuscript culture. Perhaps in contrast to a print culture in which copies of works were being reproduced, were being produced using some other technology, printing technology. In the context of a manuscript culture, this is the means by which you would actually issue for circulation a copy of your work. And then the manuscript culture also represents a coalescence of human efforts and intentions at particular moments, in particular places for production and later interaction and intervention as a hand-recorded text, and any visual content, which is also very important, is read, handled, stored, presented, purchased, divided, recomposed, etc. Codicology and other approaches to the study of manuscripts permit us to read this record of efforts and intentions along with the words and images carried by the manuscript. Okay? So again, main distinction are these contexts, these intentions associated with the production of the manuscript, with the later circulation, reception, use of the manuscript. And then again, also that our primary means for disseminating copies of works in a context like this is the production of manuscripts, this particular technology of handwriting and hand production of books to circulate copies. What is a codex?
Found manuscript.
Okay, can you say a little bit more?
It would be a manuscript generally folded into gatherings and sewn together, so it's a distinct unit.
Beautiful, thank you. Did everyone hear that? So would you mind to repeat?
It would be a manuscript that is bound together, so you have various quires, and it's a distinct unit.
Okay.
Multiple gatherings.
Okay, so I'll just repeat. So she mentioned, mentioned gatherings bound together, brought together. So, and that's excellent. That's part of what we're getting at. Thank you. Anybody else want to add to this? That's fine, that's fine. This is a codex. Okay. So a codex is a type of book. It's namely the now familiar form of book that you know well, that consists of gatherings, a term that you will hear also synonym for which is quire. I often use gathering, and so I like to have them both here because I may occasionally say gathering rather than quire, but these are equivalent terms. Each quire is comprised of folios or leaves that are sewn together, in most cases, with a cover applied to them. Okay, so a codex is a type of book format. Each gathering is typically a nest of bifolia. So this is a bifolium, where you have a sheet that's been folded to form 2 folios, 2 leaves, and 1, 2, 3, 4 pages, okay? And typically they are nested together such that they can be stitched through the fold, okay? The 2 sides of each folio we refer to as recto or verso. And you'll find often, abbreviations for that, RV or AB, but that corresponds to each side of the writing material. Typically, both sides are exploited for writing or drawing. It is important to note that you also encounter unsewn gatherings that are still brought together in a coherent form, but placed in a wrapper or a pouch, but not sewn, but resembling otherwise the codex format. Is that clear? And the plural of codex is codices. And from codex comes codicology. So what is codicology? Anybody? Yes, Chela.
Study of codices.
Yes! The study of codices, yes. Anybody want to add anything else to that? Yeah.
Particularly their physical features.
Yes, physical features, material features. All right. So the study of the book as a material object is a way I like to sort of summarize it. It's a type of book archaeology, if you will, that involves extrapolating back from material, textual, and visual evidence within a particular codex or group of codices, which is often pretty crucial, to details concerning the production and circulation of that codex or that group of codices. It's a subdomain of paleography writ large, sort of in its broadest sense in the study of writing. Paleography also means characterizing and classifying particular scripts and hands, deciphering handwritten texts, dating and placing manuscripts on the basis of their handwriting. Codicology is sort of a subdomain of that. Codicology is concerned with investigating and documenting the material qualities of books for the purposes of being able to elaborate cultures of production and to contextualize, and this is especially crucial and important for codicology, to be able to date and to place otherwise undated or unlocalized copies and associated phenomena. So codicology is very much interested in being able to take a manuscript that you otherwise have not a clear idea of when and where it was produced, and being able to say with a little more certainty, this is where and when it may have been produced, or maybe even with much greater certainty than that. So it's for those of you that have studied analytical bibliography, it's evocative of that, but for manuscripts, manuscript books. And of course, within this domain, we're particularly interested in codices, but there are also other formats like rolls, that are not proper codices, concertina, etc. And we utilized a range of techniques for the study of codices and the study of books as material objects. So visual inspection in various lighting environments. You can also use more sophisticated spectral analysis, image processing, material and chemical analysis. That, of course, is particularly of interest for covering material, media, pigments, inks, etc. Damage, assessing what's going on there, layers within painting, for example, underpainting, subsequent layers when particular color may have been added. And then other techniques include modeling, actually, or replication of observed features. So attempting to follow recipes for inks, for example, modeling book structures, okay, as you observe them, and actually producing a model that represents what you have observed. These are also important techniques that can be utilized in the context of codicology. And it's readily, as you might imagine, it's readily applied to the domain of manuscript culture because of of what it can ascertain and what it contributes as far as interrogating the evidence. So why codicological studies? You may be asking yourself. Codicological studies offer us more rigorous exploration of manuscripts as a means of interrogating the evidence within them. In particular, the evidence that touches on recording and early formation of texts and any associated visual content in particular places at particular times. Again, additional evidence that touches on a text reception and function through details of a particular witness, particularly that witness's production and its later interactions. Codicology gives us a means of interrogating that evidence. And then also craft practices or cultural practices, paradigms of production, ownership, circulation of books. Codicology assists us with interrogating the evidence that speaks to each of these. And all of this points to significant distinctions between witnesses. And so I have a couple of examples here from the UCLA collections. I'm not sure what is the best way. Can I step away from the microphone? Yeah, if you don't mind. Thank you so much. Codicology is also particularly valuable for, as I've already mentioned, witnesses that are otherwise undated. So when you're interested in exploring a text, there may be a copy of a manuscript that you're noticing is particularly rich, particularly complete, but it lacks an explicit dating. You can actually resort to examination, I would say that you should consider that essential, fundamental, to get a better sense of the dating of that particular witness. If you don't have a date for that witness, you're going to be able to say very little. All right, are we? Okay, we're still loading up on the document camera. And altogether, this evidence will speak to how the text took shape, how it evolved, its spheres of influence, how it was appreciated, studied, taught, interpreted, consulted, repurposed, revered, etc., because it speaks to the communities that considered it significant. Ooh, beautiful. All right. So this is it okay if I step away from just to confirm, is it okay if I step away from the microphone?
You can move the microphone to this whole thing.
Oh, interesting, okay. Or at least it should.
For the Zoom viewers, if you could just be kind of towards it. This is working now.
Oh, okay.
You have a way of, you can hold it or flip it on. Like.
Okay, can we zoom out just a little bit to see, is it possible to see both of them? Yeah. Hello. So, oh, my foot is in the view. So here we actually have, and I know at this stage, haha. Here we have ostensibly 2 copies of the same work. And the lesson here is just appreciation for variance across witnesses. So this poor thing, I will need both hands. It's actually going to be difficult for me to show you the opening of each of them because of some damage that this one has sustained. But these are ostensibly 2 copies of the same work. If you, which I'm afraid that you probably can't, if you could read this title inscription, this is a title piece actually here, you would see that this is actually the second part or second volume of a work entitled Al-Qamus Al-Muhit. Is anyone familiar with this dictionary. Okay. So this is a second volume. Relatively few lines per page. And this is a lengthy work, pretty dense. And so it requires multiple volumes or parts in this particular format. This is also ostensibly a second volume of Al-Qamus al-Muhit. But if you can notice, the script, the paper, it's a little bit difficult taking a look from the document camera, but there are differences. I hope you can observe differences. And if we think more carefully about when and where these may have been produced, we would see significant differences there as well. Now, this is an Arabic work, and even the script models that we have selected are those which are preferred for Arabic. So this manuscript is coming from a Persian context. This is coming from an Arab context, and the scripts are reflecting that. But we have the same script model selected for both because we're dealing with an Arabic text. Again, you can see this, again, selection of paper, selection of inks, approach to layout is somewhat similar, but you have slightly different use of red ink for borders here, rule borders. All of this is speaking to different contexts of production. If we were to investigate further, we could venture into which communities these particular copies circulated, when were they being studied, that sort of thing. Okay, the idea is just to give you a sense of why it's interesting to look at multiple copies, multiple witnesses for a particular work, and the very distinct contexts from which they can come. Okay. Okay. So we also should establish what we mean by Islamic. Okay, and I appreciated Luke's sort of introduction to this. So we use the term Islamic manuscript culture, Islamic codicology, Islamic manuscript studies, Islamic manuscripts, etc. And what do we mean by that? Well, we essentially mean produced in historically Islamic areas, cultural areas where Islam was sort of the dominant rule. These are chiefly Islamic communities that are producing these manuscripts or active in these manuscript cultures, etc. But not only, okay? So that's important to keep in mind. And that you may find, for example, manuscripts produced in Christian communities in Egypt, for example, in Arabic, that may be lumped together with Islamic manuscripts, but are not in any sense Islamic as far as their content or even as far as the experience of the particular community that produced them, but they were produced in a so-called Islamic context, potentially, insofar as in Egypt at the time of Islamic rule. So there is a focus here on Arabic script manuscripts or Arabographic, so written using a form of Arabic script. But other important paleographic traditions are also represented. So we're primarily talking about writing in Arabic script, text written in some form of Arabic script, but not only. Is that pretty straightforward? Okay, so Islamic manuscript studies. Just like to give a brief sort of overview so that you have an introduction to the field. And I'm focusing here on, as a start, as an entree, resurgence in the West. So, and it will become clear why, why this is considered a resurgence and why this is distinct from a much earlier and long-standing tradition outside of the West. So in the West, resurgence since the early 1980s, when a colloquium on paleography and codicology organized by François Darish, very important name that you will want to leave this workshop knowing very well, with the support of the BNF and the French Institute for Anatolian Studies. This was held in Istanbul, and this is the publication that came out of that colloque. This was followed by several significant research initiatives and publications, including a number of published catalogs in print, eventually electronic format, as well as the first Western language journal devoted to the study of Middle Eastern manuscripts, which is actually the first volume depicted on the right there, Manuscripts of the Middle East. The first comprehensive world survey for Islamic manuscripts, the first monograph on the codicology of Arabographic manuscripts, again written in Arabic script, the first Western language handbook on Arabic manuscript studies, and the first Western language monographic series dedicated to Islamic manuscripts and books, which are Manuscripts of the Middle East, edited by the illustrious Janusz Witkam. That publication continued from 1986 to 1992 when it ceased, but it was succeeded by the Journal of Islamic Manuscripts. If any of you have heard of this or familiar with this journal, it is the successor of Manuscripts of the Middle East, more or less. Also, prior to that, Manuscripta Orientalia appeared beginning in 1995, published by Institute of Oriental Studies at Russian Academy of Sciences, another very important journal focused on Oriental manuscripts, so-called, much more broadly defined, but many important contributions to Islamic manuscript studies are published also in that journal. The first world survey that I alluded to here, comprehensive in scope. There are other surveys by language earlier. And this comprehensive survey was published 1992 to 1994. This is with the support of Al-Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation, which is an important initiative contributing to the study of Islamic manuscripts. This was edited by Jeffrey Roper with many, many, many contributors. It is organized by country, and you will find UCLA represented in the section on the United States. Then the first monograph on the codicology of Arabic script manuscripts, published by François Darish with contributions from many other scholars as well. This is why I refer to it as Darish et al. Because there are so many contributors, it is impossible to list all of them, and it's not to erase or diminish their contributions, but simply for efficiency on the tongue. So it was first published in French, but we will discuss it again later. It has been translated to Arabic, to English, to Italian. In fact, the most recent edition from 2012 is in Italian, and each time it has been updated a little bit. So if you read any of those languages, it will benefit you to consult and potentially in all three, especially even in the Italian, again, because of the updates. Very, very much worth checking and not simply relying on whichever language you feel most comfortable with. And then the first Western language handbook on Arabic manuscript studies, which is this Vademecum of Adam Gatchik. So this was released in 2009, just after, I remember we had an intensive training with Adam at Michigan in 2009, just before the publication of this book. And he was very excited about it finally appearing. So this is an essential, I cannot tell you, an essential resource, ongoing reference for consultation in the course of your work, and we're going to return to that again. The 3 and 4 we are going to return to. And then this first series that I alluded to, first Western language monographic series, very important to emphasize. dedicated to Islamic manuscripts. This is published by Brill, beginning again in 2009. Okay, so publications indicative of this resurgence that we saw. This is just a sampling of the many initiatives in the West supporting scholarship and preservation of so-called Islamic manuscripts. Al-Furqan out of London, the Islamic Manuscript Association, which has been headquartered in Cambridge. I'm a member of the board of the Islamic Manuscript Association currently. It has suffered some setbacks, but we're very pleased that once again this year we are able to revive a program of courses. The main initiatives of this association are a grant program to fund preservation and cataloging projects, and then also, again, teaching and instruction in Islamic manuscript studies. So in 2015, for example, I organized with other colleagues a course through the association on Islamic papers and paper making. Yeah, it's a wonderful association for training, but many of the courses offered are not offered in the States. There have been actually in California courses offered in recent memory under the auspices of the association, but again, the financial situation has been a little bit tenuous. So. Institute of Oriental Manuscripts, very important, again, scholarly initiatives out of this institute, which of course has been active since the 19th century, but was reorganized properly and renaming itself as Institute of Oriental Manuscripts in 2007. And then we have the COMST initiative. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this. This was a European grant-funded initiative focused on, again, Oriental manuscripts, so very broadly defined, in place from 2009 to 2014, but exists yet in a slightly different form. So an ongoing research initiative, publishes a bulletin, a journal, a newsletter, etc. Organizes various conferences, and there are sort of research projects ongoing. And then the Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures in Hamburg, which I know that some of you are familiar with. And again, this is manuscript culture very broadly defined, not just Eastern and not only Western, but they have a wonderful focus on otherwise understudied or somewhat underrepresented manuscript cultures in traditional scholarship. So this center has been active since 2011. They are very active in organizing symposia, conferences, hosting lectures. They have a number of faculty and graduate students working on projects, and they have a publication of series. They have a journal, and they have actually a monographic series as well. Really valuable contributions. Now, it is extremely, extremely important to acknowledge that there are vitally significant scholarly and practical contributions in Eastern languages. Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Japanese. Being at UCLA is a wonderful example because what is the hand list in? Persian. So these languages and this scholarship are essential for you to consult. It is tremendous disservice to neglect or ignore. We really must be engaged. And this is a much longer established scholarly tradition in this field. This field did not begin in the 70s or in the 70s with these, or in early 80s with these fairs, focusing on Islamic culture, etc. I mean, this field has been long-standing, particularly in areas of the Middle East, Iranian world, and certain, as we were mentioning before, activity in Russia for generations. And many of these important contributions have emerged out of what is now the Institute for Arabic Manuscripts in Cairo and the Written Heritage Research Center in Tehran. And yes, Danish Paju himself, I mean, there are exemplary sort of bastion scholars in this field making contributions, but not necessarily in Western languages. Some of them have published in Western languages. Iraj Afshar, for example, a number of his publications are accessible in English or French. But for the most part, the guidance here is to be prepared to navigate this literature in Persian, in Arabic, in Turkish. There are a number of scholars. I have mentioned Japanese because there are a number of scholars active in Tokyo, also working on Islamic manuscript culture. And again, it is very important to not neglect this literature, to recognize its contributions, kind of laying the foundations, and then to engage with it as you continue in your own scholarship. That is challenging. The languages are challenging, I know, but it's very important. And if you can't manage it, to at least acknowledge that the limitations potentially of whatever sphere and whatever sort of boundary of sources you're able to work with. Okay. So all of this represents a tremendous progress. I mean, as I mentioned before, out of the scholarship in the Middle East, especially Middle East very broadly defined, and I should say Middle East and North Africa, because I don't mean also to erase Africa from the conversation. There has been, again, this steady progress, but there is so much left to be done. And if anything from this workshop, I hope I can light a fire under you, that you feel inspired just what important work it is for you to be working with manuscripts, to be contributing toward the descriptive body of data that is compiled. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of manuscripts left to be explored, to be cataloged. Still a vast amount of codicological and paleographical data that we need in order to be able to make additional conclusions. By region, by period, etc. Again, within these larger projects of manuscript cultural history, intellectual history, social history, philology, art history, etc. Just so much to be done. The last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a surge of digital initiatives, which facilitates things quite a bit, actually, through this dissemination of digital surrogates. But cataloging is, I'm not even going to venture there. It's more important. It's more important than digitization. We can expand on that. We can expand on that later if you like. But if you don't have a sense of what you're looking at, recorded in the metadata, you're not going to be able to find those images. I mean, so you need some characterization at this level of description, of cataloging, to even be able to reach, the images. And if that data is incorrect or misleading, then, then that's potentially even worse. Especially when the manuscript itself is, say, in a rough state. Like, what if it's what we say acephalous? What if it's missing its opening? Maybe it's lacking at the end as well. It could be very misleading until you spend a great deal of time sort of working with that manuscript and you realize, oh, no, this is actually, so in any case. And if you're working with a single manuscript, that's one thing. But much of the time, you need to assemble a great many witnesses. you need a significant number to be able to elaborate your analysis. And that, is incredibly tedious, virtually impossible if you don't have accurate descriptive data, or at least somewhat reliable descriptive data, useful descriptive data. The digital catalogs are incredibly valuable for that. So digital surrogates are wonderful. Digital facsimiles, if you will. Digital, what's another term that Dot likes to use? Avatars. Yeah, these are wonderful, but when they're accompanied by descriptive data, by cataloging, and when you have the descriptive data in a digital format, that is sort of the pinnacle. to be able to navigate that. You're going to see that evidence in the course of this workshop. So the digital projects that have emerged have focused mainly on digitization as a preservation strategy, as a means of mediating access, which is also incredibly important. There are issues with the accession of these manuscripts, the acquisition of these manuscripts, if we're taking any progress in decolonizing the archive, and we need to address issues of access, okay, and any claims to ownership and heritage and this sort of thing. So that's really important. Digitization as a means of mediating access cannot be understated. That is very important, but that's different than say its relative importance with respect to cataloging. They're both quite important, but cataloging is more important. So accessibility, ultimately what is the most important is accessibility. Okay, cataloging means accessibility. Without cataloging, you don't have accessibility. So a number of projects have also endeavored to offer digital access to data, descriptive data, and images, and then also companion resources. So there's a project, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, it's from several years ago, collaboration of Yale and SOAS, this kind of virtual environment for the study of manuscripts that brought together images of manuscripts, copies that are preserved in these various places, but then also some essential sort of reference works to facilitate your study of the manuscripts. And that's an example of what I'm talking about. So, all right. Everyone's still feeling encouraged, feeling inspired even. So just some workshop practicalities. So these are the two reference works that I will be constantly alluding to in the course of our day today, tomorrow, Wednesday. The shortened form that I will use to refer is at the top, Darish et al. Islamic codicology, and then Gatchik's Vademecum. I would encourage you to lay your hands on whatever edition of these works is most comfortable for you, and then the others as well, potentially. I can tell you there have been significant updates in Islamic codicology, the Darish et al., but within the Vademecum, not as significant as far as any variation. But this attests also to the significance of these works, their scholarly significance and their reach, that they have been translated. So we simply do not have time for me to reference all of the detail within, say, the Vademecum, but it is incredibly valuable. It is basically laid out like an encyclopedia. Again, it is a handbook, entry by entry, topical, and much of what we are covering you will find there in this very accessible sort of layout. And within Darish, it will become clear, organized by chapter, broader topics, but still very important discussion, kind of foundational discussion. Okay. And again, et al. Here, because there are just too many, but here because the colleagues were fewer, that I did name them. I wish I could have named all the ones that were involved in the translation of and the contributions to each of these, but in the interest of space, just know that we appreciate their contributions, and their contributions are really valuable. Okay, other resources that are really important that you may want to consult from time to time in the course of the workshop. So, who is familiar with Professor Jan-Just Wittkam's Islamic Manuscripts Reference Library? Great. If you're not, then you should be. So this is an incredible resource where Professor Wittkam has essentially gone rogue and uploaded digital copies of a vast literature in segments so that he does not violate copyright. So he'll put, say, a PDF with 10 pages of a contribution, and then the next 10 pages, and then the next 10 pages, so that he can't be said to be violating fair use. And so, yes, so you, so much of the literature that I reference, or even literature that I do not reference, is available, accessible to you here, and that includes things like hand lists and catalogs, and yeah, there's a vast amount here. I don't know if you can see how small this is, but it's incredibly, 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 incredibly vast. Okay. Another resource is my research guide. Anybody familiar with that? Okay. And within that, especially relevant will be the reading lists, which are organized by topic. Also, bibliographical resources, manuscript descriptions, that will be relevant at various stages in the workshop. And after the workshop, as you really engage with this material, believe me, I completely understand if you don't have time or space, bandwidth to be venturing off and kind of following trails in the course of what we're discussing, because that would be potentially a little bit diverting. But these are places where I recommend you go to supplement and to reinforce the reading that you do after the workshop. The reading you're all going to do, I'm sure, after the workshop. The other valuable resource, I have found it valuable for my own work, and I particularly find it valuable for my teaching such as this, is the descriptive data for the Islamic Manuscripts collection preserved at Michigan. This links to our collection research guide. Again, you're going to have these slides. This links to our collection research guide, which gives you information about the collection, but then also how to navigate and find manuscripts. So these are accessible through our online library catalog, the current iteration of which is a little sketchy, but also through our legacy catalog. And you can navigate by shelf mark, or you can actually, this is why I have the, take the time to load the page again. This is why I have the advanced search page up. You can actually navigate directly to all the records by going to special collections. Sorry, not the library. Arbitrary designations. And then, so specifying location, specifying collection. And then you do a null search or an empty search, and that will give you everything. And then you can refine over here by language and by subject. That's going to be the most useful. But then, of course, you can also search. And you can search in many different ways that may be relevant to you, including on, say, marbled paper, illustration, etc. Terms like this. And you can sort this if you're interested in just kind of getting an overview of things. The difference in these two, so this display is very abbreviated. So you have to expand all the notes to be able to see, and all the references and all the citations to be able to see them. Here, it's a little bit trickier because you can't do a null search here as well. But if you know what you're searching on, when you get to the record, you've already got the whole thing in one smooth single view, which you can then, sort of use Control F to kind of navigate. Okay, and the relevance here will become clear as we go through the workshop. I'm just pointing it out now because I suggest that you kind of return to this. And I have links throughout the lecture slides directly to catalog records. The other valuable thing about this, if I can escape and go back, well, I can't, but sorry, I can, just wasting time. Is that somehow I have, you can follow links to digital surrogates, digital copies. So the phenomena that are described here in the record, you can locate within the digital copy, and that will help you make sense of what's being described. Say you're not sure what this Waqf statement means. Well, now you can look at it. Okay. Just for example. Okay. Is that clear? Yeah, okay. In the interest of time, let's go on. Writing material. What am I doing? Sorry. Writing material. Okay, we're going to talk about parchment and paper. Are we ready? So again, this session is focused on what we refer to as writing material. You may hear it referred to as support or writing surface, even substrate, depending on your field. So this is a material that is selected for writing on, okay? In contrast to, say, writing instruments, which would be what you would write with. This is what you write on. So that's why you sometimes hear it called writing surface or support or something like that. So for using codices, we mainly encounter parchment, and in the Islamic manuscript cultures, Islamic manuscript traditions, overwhelmingly paper. That's what we encounter. So there are local products produced in the regions of interest, and then there are European imports. Papyrus is also attested, so it's important to acknowledge that. And you'll be able to read a little bit more about that in Darish, for example. But really for scant codices, mainly fragmentary. More so was papyrus used for unbound documents, epistolary, chancery sort of context. A material called luang, is anyone familiar with this? Beaten tree bark, or tapa it's referred to. That's nearer to papyrus in its preparation. But you'll hear it referred to as Javanese paper. So this was used for writing also in Java and its environs. It's another writing material that is attested. It's important to acknowledge. And beyond the codex format, we encounter wood used. It's writing boards, alwah, loh, or tablets. And that's mainly for training in literacy. And even today in traditional Quranic education in Nigeria, for example. So these are other writing materials or supports or writing surfaces that are attested, but our focus, because of the overwhelming representation of paper and then also parchment within the context of manuscript codices, that's what we're going to focus on. Okay? So parchment. What is parchment? In Arabic, you'll see it referred to as raq or riq. So this is the prepared skin of an animal, often a goat or a sheep or a hair sheep, which is difficult to distinguish from a goat, or even a ghazal. There is a strong tradition of the use of raq al-ghazal, and any and all are possible to encounter. The flesh and hair are removed from the skin of the animal, of course, after it is ritually slaughtered, and then it is stretched and dried, but it is not tanned, and that is what distinguishes it from leather, okay? It is extremely durable and long-lasting as a writing material, but also it is expensive and limited in terms of the sizes you can manage. I mean, it's a function of the size of the animal, right? Occasionally, you'll encounter it dyed, and that is indicative of greater expense, greater luxury. So it's not just used as, but it is manipulated in various ways. Both the hair and the flesh sides can be used for writing, and they have distinct characteristics. So the hair side is more receptive to ink and therefore kind of retains the ink a little bit better. You can observe follicles, and the flesh side is often a little bit paler in color. Sometimes you'll see scraping marks. Arrangement of the folios is significant, whether you have hair, flesh, whether you have hair facing or hair, flesh facing. and also whether or not it's been folded or cut down to size. Another really important characteristic of parchment is that it can be reused. So it can be scraped, washed, and reused for writing. And that's something we call a palimpsest. Is that a term that's fairly familiar to folks? Okay. It can also be reused sort of as is without any need to remove the existing writing material in binding elements. So you'll find it used in linings, spine linings, for example, or even layered as part of pasteboards or the linings of boards. As far as chronology, chronology, use of parchment and sort of characteristics over time. Already being used extensively in the ancient world at the advent of Islam. And it was utilized in the earliest extant Quranic codices. So these are from the Umayyad period. This is an example on the right. This is a folio from the extremely significant, very famous Sana'a palimpsest that is actually at Stanford. In fact, prior to the 10th century, parchment was the material of choice for the transcription of the Quran. So that is what you would have copied the Quran on, would have been parchment. And this likely emerges from the religious traditions Islam inherited from, which also preferred the use of animal skin for writing the scripture, the sacred book. We do have some Quranic fragments on papyrus attested in the extant manuscript corpus, but it's unclear whether or not those are from codices. Those could be from amulets or other kind of isolated documents, and not necessarily from codices. We can't be completely confident based on the evidence that we have. Paper was being used for other contexts, even while parchment was being used for the copying of the Quran. Paper was introduced in the 8th century. We're going to go into that. But it was mainly reserved for those other contexts. So the chancery, for example, or the copying of other texts, not the sacred text, not the Mus'haf. Parchment was preferred for transcribing the Quran until the 10th century. That's when we find the first Quranic codices copied on paper. Parchment extended a little bit after that, though, especially in the Islamic West, the Maghreb. We find parchment being used there into the 14th and the 15th century. But otherwise, it's in the rest of the Islamic world, it's pretty exceptional to encounter it after the 10th century or so. 10th century or so, you know, into the 11th. All right, so here's an example of an early Abbasid Quranic fragment on parchment. You can see some of its physical characteristics, the rippling, and it's a little bit difficult in this image, but if you were to zoom in, which you can do within the digital platform that hosts these images, you can even look very closely to try to discern follicles and that sort of thing. Any questions about parchment? Again, we're having to really move quickly through all of this in the interest of time. Yeah?
Ever a religious prohibition against using animal skin?
Not necessarily. I'm not quite sure. So because the animal skins again are prepared in the ritual fashion, and there will be certain animals that that would be preferred. I'm not aware of any such prohibition. I could be simply unaware. Yes, Chega.
Just a quick question about something that's not, it's related really just to erasable surfaces.
Yes.
What do people use for accounting?
People use for accounting?
How did they just scribble down something and then erase it?
Oh, sure, yeah. So, so paper is often used, paper or papyrus, depending on what period we're talking about, for that sort of writing. And when in the context of paper, I know less about parchment, about papyrus. In the context of paper, there are a number of things that people would use actually for erasure. Rubbing is one, abrading, but then also there are certain materials that can be laid down. They would also, and to cover or to lift. They would also place little scraps of other paper over top of what they wanted to erase. But there are a number of different things that were used. Is that helpful? Yeah. Michael. Okay, thank you. Now that you've mentioned it, I will. Does anyone know? Parchment is a very generic term, and it's deliberately generic. It is not precise. By contrast, vellum is a very precise term. Does anyone know, besides Michael, what vellum means? What vellum represents? What is vellum?
Parchment made
What kind of calf?
Baby cat?
Yeah, technically, yeah, like a uterine, well, they say a uterine, yeah, which, yeah, that's pretty intense, right? Okay, so that is a very distinct type of parchment. Parchment is a generic term used for this writing material coming from an animal skin that is untanned. Vellum is much more specific in terms of its source. And finer in quality. That's an important distinction to make. Did you want to say anything else about that?
No, I wanted you to tell us because I didn't know actually.
Oh, I see, okay. Yes.
In terms of erasure, I believe parchment can also be rinsed.
Yes, it can be washed, yeah. It can be scraped, it can be washed, yeah. Okay. Thank you. In the interest of time, we'll go into paper. I could spend all day talking about paper, but I will restrain myself. Okay. So paper. In Persian, karaz, from Sogdian, okay? In Turkish, karit. In Arabic, vara, excuse me, I'm just gonna switch back into Arabic. Warak, or through Persian, you'll also find used in Arabic in these early sources, kared or kared. Okay, so this is a complex organic product of felted fibers formed into a sheet against a mold. I wish I had a mold. Maybe we do somewhere in the library, but you can see a mold in this picture. So that's clear. A complex organic, because we're dealing with organic material, felted fibers formed into a sheet against a mold. The fibers can be from processed or unprocessed, more or less, in their origin sources. So from rag, rope, already processed, or raw sources. So that raw sources meaning bast fiber, which is the inner bark of a plant. And regardless, those fibers, from wherever they're coming, require significant processing. So they have to be cleaned and washed, cooked, soaked, also referred to as redding, cooked, beaten, significantly beaten, to prepare what is referred to as a pulp, which is added to a vat of water, and then with the mold used to form sheets. Okay, those sheets are then couched, they're removed from the mold to a post or stack of sheets that's pressed to take the water, and then each usually couple of sheets or so are parted and then dried. They may be dried against a wall, hanging on a line, or otherwise. A sizing agent, what we call a sizing agent, may be added to the vat or to the surface, and that's often some form of starch or a gum or glaire, egg white. Islamic manuscript cultures usually will burnish the paper. So that means polish it to prepare the surface for writing. So you may have a surface size applied and then also heavily polished surface. This does a couple of things. It ensures that the pen will not tear the paper. The reed pen is used for writing primarily, a cut reed. When you burnish, that ensures that you're not going to tear the paper. Surface sizing also contributes to that. And then it gives, again, a resiliency that is behaving much more like parchment. It also ensures that the ink does not bleed. So that is something we almost always encounter with writing material, paper in particular, prepared for use in Islamic manuscript codices. So paper is inexpensive, especially relative to parchment, and it can be easily fashioned in a range of sizes. It's contingent on the size of the mold that you make and how strong you are and how many people you have to pull your sheet. You can also manage a range of thicknesses, including extremely thin, very, very thin. And of course, you can manage massively large sizes, which the Ilkhanids and Timurids, and they were really fans of these massive sheets of paper in massive format. Masahif, copies of the Quran. If any of you have been to the Met, they usually have on display a folio hanging on the wall of a folio that's taller than I am, and they were very much into these massive monumental copies of the Quran, and couldn't do that with parchment, so did it with paper. All right, so papers vary by morphological features, and this is inherent in the mold construction. So you're going to hear things like laid or wove, whether there are what we call laid lines and chain lines present, the chain line distribution, presence of rib shadows, the dimensions, the presence of watermarks and countermarks, etc. So what we're talking about, I wonder if I can get, I'm not getting anything. So, and I don't think I would get it from the document camera, but for those of you that are able to see the lines running across that are spaced very close together, those are laid lines. If there were any lines perpendicular to those that would actually be spaced further apart, visible, we would refer to those as chain lines. I can tell you that they're not particularly visible in this sample, but is that helpful to get a sense of what I'm talking about when I say laid and chain lines? And these are traces or impression of the mold cover. This is the construction of the mold cover. So papers also vary by their surface characteristics in terms of how they're treated, color, tinting, any later decoration like gold flecking or marbling or that sort of thing, silhouetting. They can also be distinguished by their pulp characteristics, something we call the furnish, in terms of the clarity of the formation. Then the estimated sheet dimensions, the thickness of the paper, the fiber type, all of these are ways that you can distinguish paper. Not necessarily do you need to distinguish every sheet of paper or every folio that you encounter in a book this way, but these are ways that they can be distinguished and studied. It is particularly important to report mold characteristics because these are relatively accessible and quite revealing. So we do that measuring the spacing of laid and any visible chain lines, groupings of chain lines which we encounter, and then of course any watermarks or countermarks. Countermarks being what typically distinguishes paper by maker. Okay, so something that represents the particular manufacturer of that paper who may have used a number of different motifs for their watermark. But that's what we mean by countermark. So it's often initials, sometimes words in Arabic script, or full words in a Latin script indicating a name, a full name, or a place, that sort of thing. So those we tend to refer to as countermarks. It's good to report, if you can, things relative to the furnish, again, if it's cloudy or clear, the color, that is highly, highly subjective. So internally within your project, if you establish a standard and maintain internal consistency, that's valuable, but otherwise, what's beige and cream to you may be entirely different to someone else. So just take that with a grain of salt. There will be certain papers that are very obviously gray or very obviously brown, but beyond that, it's a little bit of a of a shoot. So if thickness is incredibly variable and can be really tricky to get at, and how to say, kind of complicated to get at because of just the variation that's possible. But it is something else that you can report. And then, of course, the surface characteristics, especially if it's burnished, and to what extent. Some things are highly, highly burnished. They will shine, gleam. And then if you can tell whether or not there's a surface size, which is really difficult to do unless you're going to do some testing, then you can also speak to that. The burnishing is pretty straightforward, but the presence of a surface size is not straightforward. Not as straightforward, and especially not to be able to tell which one. Okay, so elaborating these distinctions across the dated and localized corpus, you can actually develop typologies, okay? And that's useful for further dating and placement, which codicology is very interested in, right? And sort of codicology is an important contribution in many ways. At this stage, watermarks and countermarks and group chain lines are particularly useful for this type of dating and localizing. So paper was likely introduced from Central Asia, having reached Samarkand and Khorasan from China. From there into the Persianate and Central Islamic lands in the 8th century. Okay. Thereafter, the technology spread. You have it eventually reaching Europe by way of Sicily and Spain. Okay. And the earliest known Arabic documents on paper are from 8th century Khorasan. And earliest confidently dated Arabic manuscript codex on paper is from 866. So speaking of Professor Whitcomb, you will find images of this here on his site, and he has some detailed information about it, which I've linked here for you. Now, there is another codex which Beit Ari claims, he is how to say, preeminent in the field of Hebrew codicology. He claims this is preserved in Alexandria and has a date of 233, around 844 or so, but this is still unverified. But you will see that figure reported also. And again, we're talking about the earliest confidently and explicitly dated, so with a date on paper from a codex. So there are documents, of course, isolated documents, individual folios, etc. Earlier, potentially. Again, these documents from Khorasan, I've referenced the publication. They're quite a bit earlier, again, 8th century. Earliest known dated manuscript codex on paper is from 1055. That's preserved in Vienna. The most widely attested writing material in the Islamic manuscript corpus, almost exclusively after the 10th century, is paper. Just if you encounter a so-called Islamic manuscript from within a collection characterizing itself as an Islamic manuscript collection, unless you're dealing with a copy of the Quran, which you hopefully would know, you're going to encounter paper. It's almost certain that what you're looking at will be on paper, some kind of paper. Initially, regional products were used. So this is the technology that came in, not just the product being imported. The technology came as well. Regional production got underway pretty robustly. And initially, these regional products were used. European imports became increasingly utilized from the 15th century, and by the latter 16th century had overtaken the market, especially in the Arab lands. The local production continued in Persianate areas, so in Iran, in India, Central Asia, and you see actually these local products appearing in manuscripts and printed books into the 20th century. At the same time, European imports were also being utilized, so you see sort of both. And it was a pretty common situation, again, within the 16th century and on in Persianate areas, you may encounter, actually from more likely from the 17th century on in Persianate areas, you may encounter either a watermark paper or a local product, but you might be more likely to encounter a local product. In, say, Ottoman areas, you may encounter a product from Persianate areas that the Ottomans were using, okay? Or you may encounter a watermarked paper. So the Arab products are less to be found, again, in the 16th century, you'll still occasionally find them, but after that, not. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Chinese paper because you see it some in Southeast Asia, and I've seen some of it in Persian manuscripts.
Yes, absolutely. Chinese paper is very important to be watching for as well. Didn't have time to quite go into that, but I think I do have a citation to point to it through a couple of Annabelle's blog posts. And Chinese paper is often, and Devin can say quite a bit more about this than I, distinguished by stamps. So there are other ways to distinguish, but yes, you should be prepared to encounter possibly papers from other production. Thank you. So this, I don't know how, sorry, I don't know how well you can see this, but this is an example of what we would refer to at this stage in our understanding, a product from within the Arab context, not precisely sure where produced, but there are group chain lines here, which I'm going to have to step over and try to point out. There's a group of 3 right here, and there's a group of 3 right there. Can you see that? I'm sorry that in the slides which you will have, it's a little more obvious. So this is 15th century. Here, hopefully it's a little clearer. Laid lines are running this way. Chain lines are running this way. And chain lines, which are always much further spaced apart, in this case are grouped. This is typical of Arab production. And here we have groups of 3. So there is a group of 3. Okay, is that clear? Actually, that's a group of 2 up there. So this is another thing, sorry, this is another thing to point out. So the groupings could be 3s, 2s, some combination of which, and it might be in a particular pattern, and that actually could be deliberate to distinguish that particular manufacturer's product, similar to a watermark. No, this is paper. So where you're seeing writing, that's just because you're looking at this in transmitted light. So you're seeing writing from the reverse as well as from the surface that you're actually looking on. Yeah.
What about quality between like the European and the local? Is there any difference or it's the same industry?
It depends. So in terms of what you mean by quality, and in terms of, again, particular historical moments and particular production in particular places. So for the most part, the quality is quite comparable, more or less, in terms of serving as a surface for writing. But again, this reputation is part of what led to the overwhelming of the Arab production market by the European imports. That there was a diminish in reputation only for the quality of those local products compared to what was being imported. This is an example of a watermarked paper, a fairly early watermarked paper. So this manuscript copied in 1401 or 2. This is a bow and arrow watermark. Again, laid lines are running this way, chain lines are running this way. So in contrast, most European papers have regularly spaced chain lines that are usually single. Occasionally you'll find pairs very close together, but ordinarily they're single chain lines that are regularly spaced. There's a little bit of variation, so you might say the difference of 28 and 30 millimeters C, but otherwise fairly consistently spaced. And in contrast to these groups and a little bit more variation in the spacing that you would see, particularly in products of Arab production. Hopefully this helps illustrate what we were just talking through. So as far as production in Islamic lands, there are many studies that have investigated this production techniques. So we have historical developments of the craft, so that's mainly interrogating written sources, narrative sources that are referencing in some way the use of paper or the introduction of the technology, etc. Then you have studies addressing typologies, so attempting to elaborate these from assessment of accessible features, drawing on the extant manuscript corpus. So those are, there especially what we have at this point as far as data is morphological, so focused on the traces of the mold cover, the laid and the chain lines, their spacing, their measurements, and compiling that according to date and place of use as attested in a particular manuscript that is dated, competently dated and localized. Then we have studies that actually combine physical evidence from the manuscript corpus with evidence in historical treatises and practical knowledge of papermaking techniques. We have studies that attempt to replicate the techniques. So they've attempted to produce their own mold, for example, attempting to pull sheets as they have observed, for example, in ethnographic research, where the tradition continues in some form, or attempting to achieve sort of similar features that they've observed by actually replicating techniques. And then there are studies that are focused on material composition, addressing fiber type, sizing agents, and fillers. So there are some important, still evolving, very much still preliminary and still evolving typologies based on this work. So one of the essential sort of typologies is that it was first elaborated by Don Baker before his untimely death, and then taken up by Helen Loveday. And this is published in 2001. As you can see, it's got quite a bit of age on it, but still holds up relatively well to a certain extent. It's just not very refined at all. As you can see, I mean, Syro-Egyptian, produced in Arab areas, that's incredibly, incredibly broad. And then Persian papers is also incredibly broad. And so there's much more to be done to refine this typology further. So what distinguishes the papers that are more or less of Arab production, these clustered chain lines, predominantly in groups of 3 from the 15th century. And this is from work that I've done with a colleague. This is particularly what we see. We see it elsewhere in the literature. Groups of 3 are quite common in the 15th century. You see it in so-called shades of cream, tend to be fairly thick, unclear formation, uneven fiber distribution, burnished, but often lightly, to the extent that they don't necessarily seem burnished unless you look at them in just the right light. And they're not always surface-sized. In contrast, Persian papers, the chain lines are often indiscernible. You can't see the chain lines. You have to believe they're there, holding the mold together. And having made paper myself, I can demonstrate that if you use a very fine material for the chain lines, or I can attest, if you use a very fine material like horsehair, rather than something like grass to weave the mold cover, you don't get traces of the chain lines. So the chain lines are often indiscernible. When they are discernible, they're often visible as short lengths, so they're only visible like a very short distance into the paper, and you have to be very diligent about examining quite extensively within the manuscript or across the bifolium before you can get a sense of whether or not there are any chain lines visible. Sometimes they'll appear to be curving. They're not curving. The mold was not sagging. That has more to do with the way they were couched, potentially the way they came off the mold, than certainly to do with anything then related to the mold itself. The chain lines are the late lines are often described as sagging too, because they will sometimes have this gentle curve. Do I have an example here? You can see all of this afterward if you want to. Sometimes you can get this kind of like waving effect. And again, I can attest, you can achieve that if you're really interested by couching badly. But otherwise, not a dysfunction of the mold. So this is a contrast for these papers produced in Persian areas. And we're including within that India and potentially into Central Asia, because the traditions there very much borrow from one another, the Central Asian and Indian. Okay, so sometimes groups of 2 will also be observed as far as the chain lines. The coloration tends to be browner, beige, and then in the Qajar period, often gray, and very distinctly gray. From the 15th century, in her study, Helen's study, which is a fairly large corpus, she was seeing them especially thin and crisp, and this is attested in the manuscript corpus. The furnish and fiber distribution can often be fairly clear, fairly even, and they're often heavily surface-sized and burnished. And that will give you this effect of a sheen, a very powerful sheen or gleam. You might be able to see the strokes of the burnisher. And then as far as the surface sizing, usually, again, if you're not testing, you're not going to be confident in that, but you might see like, a certain crispness that's related to the surface sizing that's been applied. So for the most part, regional products are distinguished from the European imports in their manner of mold construction. So as I was just describing, so mainly laden chain lines that in certain contexts will be grouped, those chain lines, clustered, but otherwise no other sort of motifs. The sheet formation is often different, so the sheet formation does tend to be a little bit clearer in the European. And then the surface preparation. So the European imports, interestingly enough, they would come in potentially unsized, and animal sizes were often used in Europe. But they would come in, they would actually be imported unsized, but then they would be sized and burnished locally. Okay. So that is more of a regional practice, though. It's not coming from Europe. European papers typically incorporate watermarks, so that's the primary distinction. Marks in regional products are almost unheard of, but thanks to a recent publication by Alice Chaffee-Leblanc in this edited volume that came out, our edited volume came out last year, we have attested an Arabic script watermark, very early watermark, in a 14th century copy of the Quran produced in Shiraz. I mean, it's incredible. I don't know. Really, really incredible. So this is exceptional, though. This is remarkably exceptional. What we more often encounter are these, groupings of chain lines, particularly for papers produced in Arab areas, or what may appear to be a complete lack of chain lines that are not visible, distinguishable. So when it comes to watermarks, we can turn to catalogs, databases, and data also on group chain lines, or similar compilations of data for the local products to try to get a sense of approximate dating and placement. Yeah.
Does it have any significance?
So we are going to look at an example, if we have time, an example of blue paper. I think there's a little bit more to be done to be able to speak to precisely the significance, but paper that has been tinted blue is attested. We encounter it quite often, so later, meaning 19th century, especially in Persianate areas and areas of Central Asia, into India. And I don't know that I can say much more about it than that. An area of study. But yes, it is attested. And if I can say anything, it would be, again, that this is sort of the context in which we encounter it. And many of these papers are Russian, actually, that I can say. Okay, so here's what I mean when I was describing earlier, this sort of suggested reading. For you to, depending on the level of engagement you'd like to take with this material, here are some recommendations for reading, some reference works, and this will kind of give you an overview of what we've just been talking about.